Let's say, for the sake of argument, you wanted to know how a system like capitalism works. It would be a good idea to ask people how it might actually work. I've heard some things about this Ben Shapiro. Let's see if he can say something about how capitalism works.
Let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Huh. How is a housing market going to work if all the houses are underwater? He must be having an off day. What about this Stefan Molyneux person? He says he's an anarcho-capitalist. Maybe he knows how capitalism works. Oh dear. Well, I'm sure he wasn't that good anyways. Oh, well, what's this fellow with the beard then? Maybe he knows. Okay. Jokes aside, I think this is a really interesting and complicated question, especially more than it might seem. If you ask someone, like say Ben Shapiro, how capitalism works, you'd probably get an answer something like this.
If you're asking me if a bunch of workers decide to get together and form a joint stock corporation, of course, that's how most corporations are formed. Most LLCs are formed this way. It's a couple of guys who get together, band their labor together. It's like 2 guys. And then after it grows, they decide to hire other people. So we need to be very specific. When you talk about the ownership of the means of production, are you talking about my version, because that's called capitalism, or are you talking about where the government owns the means of production or crams down on voluntary associations' rules as to the means of production?
This seems like a fine, almost intuitive understanding of the world in capitalism, but it is insufficient in a number of ways. Where did the factory owner get their money from? Did they actually acquire it from labor, or was it stolen perhaps via the mechanisms of imperialism? Did they benefit from colonization to get land that they wouldn't have had, or were they colonized and had their land stolen from them? There's a lot more to say about this, in a future video perhaps, but Ben is right about one thing, although he doesn't quite mention it. At the heart of the system of capitalism are incentives, and these incentives are such that they direct the behavior of capitalists and workers alike. This video is about incentives, and how in capitalism, those incentives are often radioactively toxic. A lot of capitalist economists, like, for example, Milton Friedman, would say that capitalism operates on an assumption of rational expectations. The idea is that people are rational agents inside of the economic system of capitalism, and that, on average and over time, the choices that they make tend to be rational in their favor and, importantly, towards their own self-interest. This seems very strange to anyone who has ever worked in retail, but really I think our current pandemic demonstrates that humans behave more like characters in The Sims than we do perfectly rational decision makers. But there is a kernel of truth here. What drives a lot of decision making are incentives. An incentive is simply just a motivating factor in you making a certain choice. Have you ever seen a buy one get one free deal? Well, that's an incentive. It's trying to get you to do something. A socialist, like myself, might argue that the very existence of an advertising industry actually undermines people's ability to make rational economic choices about the products and services that they would choose to buy. But I digress. We are surrounded by incentives, but not always the same ones. A CEO of a company is driven by very different incentives than, say, a bus driver or a janitor. A great deal of what incentivizes our behavior in a capitalist system comes down to the environment that we find ourselves in with regards to making these choices. For example, not starving and having to work a job to get food is a big incentive in most people's lives. However, it's important to note that incentives are never a guarantee of an outcome, but they merely tend to produce certain outcomes, especially on average and over time. For someone who is a CEO, their incentives derive from pleasing the shareholders of their company. After all, the shareholders are the ones to whom the fiduciary responsibility is actually owed. If you've ever wondered why press reports about a company and shareholder reports about that same company are different, now you know why. So, if you're a CEO and your incentives are to keep the shareholders happy, and thus keep your job, your first, and some would say only responsibility, is to keep increasing the share price. Why keep increasing? Well, the more the share price goes up, the more money the shareholders can potentially earn on their investments. As a shareholder, you always want to try and maximize the amount of return that you could get on your investment. The more returns you can get, the more you can invest, and the better off your investment will be. So let's look at a simple example. Say you're the only shareholder in a Utah tech company. You have to pick a new CEO since the last one maybe got indicted on criminal charges. It totally has nothing to do with the fact that being in a position of power over other people incentivizes those people to abuse their power, but let's move on. So you have to pick between two CEOs. Let's call them Bob and Mike. You ask them both to prepare a plan about how they're going to run the company as your CEO. Bob's plan goes something like this. First, we gotta cut back on waste disposal by switching to a cheaper disposal service, one with maybe a questionable history of actually safely managing that e-waste. 2. We fire the workers who keep threatening to form a union and replace them with workers from out of state. 3. A new policy of workers wearing wristbands that monitor their vital signs to make sure that no one is just relaxing on company time, say by browsing Reddit when they should be programming. Mike's plan looks like this. First, change the office policy about maternity and paternity leave to meet the state guidelines. 2. Offer some of the older employees early retirement and retrain younger employees to take their positions at a lower salary. 3. Apply for more contracts with the state penitentiary to get a more reliable and stable income. As the only shareholder, you have a choice. You can go with the CEO whose plan is more risky and long-term, i.e. Mike, or you can go with Bob, who has definitive and short-term improvements to the company's bottom line. Of course, the incentive here is to pick Bob. Bob's plan might seem very harsh, if not outright illegal in some places, and at this point you might accuse me of deliberately stacking the deck. But in truth, these policies are far from imaginary and rare. Rather, companies everywhere, big and small, pursue policies like these all the time. If they are breaking the law, it takes a great deal of government effort to make them actually criminally liable. And even then, most of the punishments rarely fit the severity of the crimes. For example, look at all the fines that have been levied against ExxonMobil for all the environmental damage that they've caused. Now compare that number against how much money they get in, say, a year, or a month, or even a day. Which one looks like it's actually hurting their bottom line? But back to the example. Mike's plan does seem a little bit better, but if you look at it, the company is just doing the bare minimum of decency by complying with state guidelines. Not to mention, if you bring in an outside context, Mike's plan to bolster the security apparatus of the state is definitely worrying. Not to mention, he plans on targeting the oldest employees who are, especially in modern times, some of the most vulnerable. Both of these plans fundamentally stem from the same place, namely the profit equation, which is profit equals income minus expenses. Bob's plan primarily aims at reducing those expenses. Unions, for example, drive up the cost of wages. Waste disposal is expensive. And trying to squeeze every ounce of productivity from your workers, well, that's going to cut your expenses by quite a bit and improve your productivity. Mike's plan, in contrast, tries to balance between trying to reduce expenses by paying employees less and having them do more, but also to try and grow the income. But as you can see, it's very obvious that his plan is not very bold. How can you grow your company? And the answer is, on a planet with finite resources and finite potentials, there are very hard limits to how big companies can really get. And what these hard limits mean is that sooner or later, you are going to run out of the ability to grow. And once you can't grow organically or realistically or even naturally, then you have to start thinking about ways to grow unnaturally, or perhaps reduce your expenses even further. That is, for example, where someone might choose to switch from fully paid union workers to, say, illegal immigrants who are much easier to exploit and much easier to get to work for lower wages. What is important to note is that the incentives that push you as the shareholder to make your decision about the CEO do not occur in a vacuum. The other shareholders of other companies are all in similar decision-making positions. Because you are competing against them, the one who can get the advantages first, like for example increased profits, will be able to leverage that advantage for more advantages. That's how capitalism works. The winners are more likely to win, and the losers are more likely to lose. And so, when you play this game, you have to play to win. Importantly, the incentives that drive you to pick Bob as the CEO also affect him. He knows that if he can't deliver on those improving returns, he will be replaced. And also, in the back of Bob's mind, is that the company has a limit on what it can grow to. It has a limit on how far profits can be maximized. And importantly, these limits are both from the natural world and also from legal and ethical frameworks that are imposed by society. Once Bob reaches those limits, however, he'll have to make increasingly unethical decisions to continue to improve those returns, or maybe, perhaps maybe, he'll be replaced by a CEO who will be unfettered by those concerns. And he doesn't want to lose his job, so he has a choice to make. He has to make those unethical decisions to keep improving the profit, or he'll get replaced by someone who will. Maybe instead of switching to cheaper waste disposal, he might decide to cut it out entirely. It's the kind of thing that happens all the time in capitalism. So here's the kicker. Capitalism as a system is entirely amoral. That's moral with an A. That means it's unconcerned with the morality of the choices being made under it and for it. The only choices that matter are the ones that maximize or increase profits. If faced with an ethically bad decision that increases profit, like for example polluting a river instead of paying for waste disposal, or an ethical one that doesn't, the incentives of capitalism will on average result in unethical behavior being done. Capitalism is unconcerned either way. This is why, to outsiders of the system, like normal working people, many of the business decisions taken by people above them seem short-sighted, heartless, or even downright just malicious. The logic of capitalism is to exclude the ethical or moral value of any choice, and reduce it to only a single thing. Does this drive profit or not? It's a toxic game with toxic incentives. And guess what?
From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.